The KE ambassador called humanity prey on a Tuesday. Mara Voss heard the death sentence through a borrowed translation earpiece 3 seconds after everyone else in the chamber, which meant she was the last person in the room to react, and consequently the only person who did not react at all. She was too busy watching her pen roll across the floor. It had slipped off the table when the ambassador's voice hit a register that vibrated through the metal floor, rolling toward the base of a raised platform designed to make its occupant look like a god. The ambassador was 7 feet of deep-water scales and bioluminescent patterns currently lit in a glow that Mara knew from a briefing document was the KE equivalent of polite contempt. Mara wanted her pen back. The Galactic Conclave's classification board had spent 210 years studying humanity from an uninvited distance and had arrived at a 17-volume conclusion. We were pre-class, soft bodies, no armor, no venom, short lifespans, emotionally volatile. The board noted with something close to pity that humans had survived long enough to achieve interstellar travel, which was frankly impressive for a species that ranked so poorly on every biological threat metric. No species had ever successfully appealed a classification. The KE ambassador looked down from his height. Mara leaned across his personal space, a zone currently occupied by an apex predator's threat display, retrieved her pen and put it in her jacket pocket. The room was silent enough to hear a heartbeat. "Does the human delegation acknowledge?" the translator hissed. Mara looked at the board representative. She looked at the 40 KE warships parked in orbit outside the viewport, arranged in a formation that was not technically a threat. Technically. "Sure," she said. The chamber exhaled. The ruling was filed, prey class designation effective immediately, trade routes slashed, military sovereignty nullified, protection minimal. Mara opened her notebook and wrote 3 words. Call home. She underlined them once. She did not underline them. Twice because she had learned on a station she no longer talked about that when things were bad enough to warrant a second line. The underlining was already beside the point. She called from a booth that smelled like recycled air and someone else's lunch. She gave her report in 28 words. She ate a stale granola bar. The response came 28 minutes later, routed through 6 government departments and the weight of 8 billion people who didn't know this was happening. It was 11 words. Understood, hold position, do not escalate. We are sending the other thing. Mara read it twice. She didn't know what the other thing was, but she had an idea. 3 days later, the other thing arrived on a civilian transport, eating instant noodles from a thermos and wearing a jacket that had survived a decade more than it should have. Commander Deong Park was 51 years old, retired Special Forces, and current director of Xenobiological Threat Assessment. It was a title that sounded like paperwork until you realized the paperwork involved contingency plans for scenarios most governments preferred to believe were impossible. He sat in her narrow quarters, offered her the mediocre noodles, and watched the viewport. "The KE think they have time," he said quietly. "They always think they have time." He explained the project humanity had been running for 40 years, an officially non-existent department called the Library. It didn't hold weapon specs. It held biological thresholds. The precise environmental and psychological conditions under which a species' decision-making failed. The KE, for instance, had no architecture for sustained uncertainty. They won the first wave or they malfunctioned. The next morning, a Velhari representative, a small iridescent being from a species that survived by being overlooked, pressed a data chip into Mara's hand. She read it in a bathroom stall. It was a record of every military engagement the KE had initiated in 4 centuries. Every species classified as prey was gone. The list of the dead was longer than a list of the living. The final entry was wet ink. Humans. Mara folded the chip into her pocket next to her pen. She went back to the chamber, bought a drink for the Velhari attendant, and tipped him more than was suggested. Small things mattered. She found Park in the corridor after a session where the KE had officially stripped humanity of its trade routes. "How bad?" she asked. Park was silent, the functional silence, of a man sorting truth from noise. You know how sometimes you poke something and you think it is finished, but it is just waiting, he asked. Yes, we are the thing that was waiting. That night, the KE ultimatum arrived. Humanity could accept integration, provisional slavery, or a 40-year arbitration process they were guaranteed to lose. It was a masterpiece of formal aggression. Mara made coffee and watched the warships orbit like wolves. She sent a message to Park. He replied, "I know, stand by." For the next 36 hours, Mara didn't fight. She didn't scream. She did paperwork, real tedious administrative machinery, requisitions for medical bays, visa protocols, a 3-page complaint about the height of the chairs in the main chamber. She got the chairs approved, and then on the 37th hour, Earth responded, not from a military channel. The response came from 47 different points across 17 different star systems. It came from human workers, researchers, and engineers who had spent 40 years being exactly what the prey designation suggested: harmless, useful, and easily overlooked. The KE ran the numbers, and for the first time in their history, the numbers were wrong. The error in the KE threat assessment models was not a decimal point or a miscalculated fleet tonnage. It was a failure of imagination. General Esrethva summoned Mara to a room built to remind her that she was small, where the chairs were too tall and the air was calibrated for a predator's lungs. Mara sat with her feet 2 inches from the floor, feeling 12 years old and nursing a very specific, familiar kind of anger, as Rethva's bioluminescence was a jagged, aggressive pulse. "Why have you not selected one of our generous options?" the general asked. Mara didn't look at the general's claws. She looked at her notebook. "We chose a 4th option," she said. She explained it in the plainest language possible. Humanity was withdrawing. Every researcher, every engineer, every medical technician currently maintaining the Conclave's backbone would be gone in 14 months. The room went silent, a heavy, airless vacuum. Esrethva had the numbers now. 11 critical infrastructure systems, from the agricultural grids of the moon species to the very pathogen resistance protocols protecting the KE medical fleet, were built on human-modified code. "We didn't plan a dependency," Mara said, leaning back into a chair that finally, thanks to her, paperwork had been adjusted to her height. "We were just good enough for long enough that you forgot we were there." The general's jaw glowed a dark, bruised purple, the KE sign for a mind that had no move left on the board. "What are you?" Esrethva whispered. Mara thought of the 17 volumes of evidence that called her prey. "We are the ones who outlasted everything that ever tried to eat us," she said. "Your move." The KE did not wait 14 months. They struck on a Wednesday. 40 vessels hit 3 human colony worlds in a first wave that was fast, clean, and devastating, executed by a military that had never needed a second wave. Mara heard the news from Park in a station corridor at 600 hours. She was holding a cup of station coffee that was still too hot to drink. She held it anyway, letting the heat bite into down her palms. "Casualties?" she asked. "Lower than their models predicted," Park said, his voice as even as a flat line. The civilian evacuation protocols had been in place for 11 years, hidden in plain sight. But the KE doctrine was built on the certainty that the first blow is the only blow. They didn't understand that for a human, a wound is just a reason to stop playing by the rules. 14 days later, the second wave launched, and that was when the galaxy learned what happens when you treat a load-bearing species like a target. 11 KE warships didn't just fail, they vanished from the tactical net. A power relay network, upgraded 18 months ago by an engineer from Bristol named Owen Garrett, did something the KE assessment hadn't modeled. It wasn't a weapon. It was a maintenance protocol that, under a very specific set of formation conditions, turned a transit corridor into a microwave. Owen Garrett was back on Earth, probably watering his garden, unaware that he had just crippled a fleet. Mara continued her paperwork, responding to 17 different diplomatic inquiries with the measured grace of a spider waiting for a vibration. She called home, a 14-minute delay. Her mother talked about the neighbor's dog for 9 minutes. minutes. It was the most useful conversation of Mara's week. It reminded her what she was protecting, a world that didn't even know it was at war. By week 8, the KE Logistics Command found that their supply chains weren't destroyed, they were rerouted. The code was elegant, invisible, and it left exactly one thread for the KE to find. It was a message written in the architecture of their own empire. We were here before you looked. Then, in the silence of week 9, Mara's terminal chimed with a notification from a sender she hadn't heard from in 11 years. A return address from a station she never named. She stared at it for 4 hours before opening it. It was a 3-word ghost that changed everything. The message was simple, stark, and entirely impossible. Still here, waiting. Mara didn't respond. Instead, she turned the screen face down and let the ghosts of Europa settle in the corners of her room. She had spent a decade convincing the Conclave that she was a bureaucrat with a penchant for paperwork, but the name on that message belonged to a version of her that knew how to survive a vacuum with a broken suit and a dying battery. She walked to the observation deck where Commander Park was staring at a tactical display that looked like a bloodied map. The KE had pulled back to regroup, a maneuver that didn't exist in their 400-year military history. In the Keth language, there was no word for a strategic retreat, only tactical repositioning, and the absence of that vocabulary was causing a systemic rot in their command structure. They were experiencing a malfunction they couldn't name. Park didn't look up when she arrived. He just pointed at a pulsing red cluster in the Orion sector. They're trying to understand why their ships are starving, he said. We didn't cut their fuel lines. We just convinced their automated tankers that the ships weren't there anymore. It's not sabotage, it's a clerical error in the fabric of their reality. Mara watched the icons flicker. It was clean, bloodless, and terrifying. But the atmosphere in the conclave chamber was shifting. The Predator-class species, once so graceful and loud, were moving with a new jagged hesitation. They were watching the humans now, not with pity, but with the focused intensity of an animal trying to find the trap it just stepped into. Mara took advantage of the silence. She invited the representatives of the 3 prey-class species, the Velhari, the Moon, and the Sherath, to a working lunch in a room with adjusted chairs. Over mediocre station synth protein, she didn't talk about war. She talked about humanitarian aid. She talked about sharing medical resources. She listened to the way their voices shook when they mentioned the Keth, and she realized that for 2 centuries, the galaxy hadn't been a community, it had been a pantry, and the humans were the only ones who had figured out how to lock the door from the inside. By week 12, the Keth General Ezrethva was no longer demanding explanations. She was sending inquiries. The bioluminescence along her jaw had turned a stuttering, irregular gray. It was the color of uncertainty. Park called it the library effect, the moment a species realizes that every reflex they've ever had is being used as a lever against them. But as Mara walked back to her quarters, the 3-word message burned in her pocket. She knew that the KE were reaching their threshold, and an apex predator that cannot resolve a conflict through force eventually defaults to its most primal instinct, total erasure. She finally reached for her terminal, her fingers hovering over the keys. She didn't type a greeting, she typed a coordinate. Then the station's proximity alarms began to scream. The sound of a station alarm is not a siren, it is a physical vibration that crawls up your spine and rattles your teeth. It was the frequency of panic, and it meant something had just entered the local space-time without an invitation. Mara didn't look at the viewport. She looked at the terminal. The coordinate she had just typed was still there, a ghost of a destination she wasn't ready to visit. She cleared the screen and ran for the command deck, her boots hitting the metal floor in a rhythm that matched the pulsing red lights. Park was already there, leaning over a sensor technician's shoulder. The air in the room smelled like ozone and recycled sweat. "It is not the fleet," Park said, his voice cutting through the noise like a scalpel. "It is a single signature, high mass, no transponder. It had jumped in inside the Massage station's minimum safe distance, a maneuver that should have shredded its hull." Mara looked at the screen and saw a shape that didn't belong to any conclave design. It was a jagged, light-drinking needle scarred by atmospheric re-entry and micrometeorite impacts. It was a human ship, but not one she recognized from the diplomatic registers. It was the other thing in its most literal, terrifying form. Before the station's automated turrets could lock on, a transmission broke through every speaker on the deck, bypassing the KE encryption filters as if they weren't out there. The voice was distorted, raspy with the mechanical edge of a long-range comms link. "Ambassador Voss, we received your signal. The package is ready." Mara felt the eyes of the entire room on her, including General Isrethva, who had appeared at the entrance, her scales a frantic, shimmering white. The general didn't look like a conqueror. She looked like someone watching a ghost story come to life. The package was not a bomb or a virus. It was a data stream, a living map of every KE dark site, every hidden shipyard, and every supply cache the Dominion had spent 4 centuries hiding from the Conclave. It was the ultimate betrayal of the Prey-class designation. We hadn't just survived. We had been taking notes. As the data began to upload, the single human needle ship turned on its axis, its engines flaring with a violent, beautiful white light. It didn't fire a single shot. It didn't need to. It had just handed the galaxy the keys to the Dominion's front door. Esrethva's voice was a low, guttural snarl when she finally spoke. "This is an act of total war." Mara didn't flinch. She just straightened her jacket. "No, General," she said. "This is an audit." But as the needle ship jumped back into the void, leaving the station reeling in its wake, Mara realized the coordinate she had typed earlier was no longer just a ghost. It was a heartbeat, and it was getting louder. The audit, as Mara called it, had a physical weight. On the Conclave's main viewing screen, the 17th volume of the KE assessment was being overwritten in real time by a cascading torrent of human-verified data. Thousands of coordinates pulsed into existence, locations that, according to KE official records, were empty void. They weren't empty. They were the lungs of an empire. General Esrethva didn't move, her massive frame frozen as she watched 4 centuries of strategic secrecy evaporate in a 60-second upload. The silence on the command deck was absolute, broken only by the hum of cooling fans and the wet, rhythmic clicking of the general's throat. Commander Park stepped forward, his boots clicking on the metal floor with a deliberate, unhurried pace. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at Esrethva. "You told the Conclave we were prey because we lacked natural armor," Park said, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm register he used for finality. "You forgot that armor is heavy. It makes you slow. It makes you predictable." He gestured toward the screen. "We don't need armor when we already know where you're going to stand." Mara watched the general's bioluminescence. It had gone from frantic white to a dull, bruised, leaden color. The Predator was realizing the cage wasn't around the humans, it was around the Dominion. But the victory felt hollow in Mara's chest. She could still feel the vibration of that needle ship in the station's hull, a reminder of the message in her pocket and the ghost she had summoned. By the 14th hour of the upload, 3 other Predator-class species had already moved their fleets to a neutral posture, effectively abandoning the KE to their fate. The power dynamic of the galaxy wasn't shifting, it was shattering. Mara returned to her quarters, her hands trembling as she reached for the communication device. She didn't look at the tactical maps or the casualty reports from the colony worlds. She looked at the 3 words from 11 years ago. She finally pressed the accept icon on the coordinate she had sent. The screen flickered and a face appeared, older, scarred, but with eyes that still held the cold fire of Europa Station. "Mara," the voice said, stripped of its mechanical distortion. "You took your time." Mara didn't breathe. "I had a war to finish, Elias." The man on the screen didn't smile. He just looked at the data stream scrolling behind her. "The war isn't finished. The KE just realized they've been playing the wrong game, but the others, the ones you think are your friends now, they're watching you too. They're wondering what else you've been writing down." Outside the viewport, a second human ship identical to the first blinked into existence. The second needle ship didn't transmit a data stream. It transmitted a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight on the station's hull. Mara watched from her viewport as the two vessels paired up, drifting in a slow, lethal dance that mocked the massive KE warship still loitering in the distance. Elias's face on her terminal was a cartography of old scars, each one a lesson humanity had learned the hard way, while the rest of the galaxy was busy being comfortable. "The Conclave is already calling for an emergency session, Mara," Elias said, his voice like grinding gravel. "They want to know if the library has a volume on them, too." Mara looked at her notebook, the ink of her shorthand nearly invisible in the dim light of her quarters. "It doesn't matter if we do," she whispered. "It only matters that they think we do." She ended the transmission and walked back to the session chamber, where the atmosphere had curdled from arrogance into a cold, sweating terror. The KE delegation was no longer sitting on their raised platform. They had descended to the floor, standing in a huddle that looked suspiciously like a cornered animal's last stand. Generalist Rethva wasn't there, but the board representative, the thin gray being who had first called humanity prey, was trembling so violently his robes rustled like dry leaves. He looked at Mara as she entered, and for the first time his translator didn't hiss. It whimpered. "Ambassador Vost," he rendered, "the board requires clarification. These vessels, these files, they were not part of your initial disclosure." Mara didn't sit. She stood in the center of the room, feeling the eyes of 100 different species, predators, prey, and everything in between, searching her face for a mercy she wasn't sure she had left. "We disclosed what was required for a prey-class species," she said, her voice echoing in the vast, hollow space. "We didn't think you'd be interested in our contingency plans for an apex-level threat." A low murmur broke out, a sound of shifting scales and clicking mandibles. It was the sound of 100 empires recalculating their worth. Park appeared at her side, leaning in to whisper a single number that made her blood turn to ice. 14. 14 more signatures had just jumped into the system, all of them human, all of them dark. The Keth weren't regrouping anymore. They were fleeing, and the rest of the Conclave was realized that the door we had locked from the inside now had a much larger predator standing behind it. The 14 human signatures didn't move. They hung at the system's edge like a collection of sharpened obsidian blades, cold and unblinking. On the station's tactical overlay, they weren't classified as warships because they lacked the massive thermal footprints of Conclave dreadnoughts. Instead, they were ghosts, silent and efficient, ghosts that had spent 40 years watching the galaxy from the shadows. Mara looked at the board representative, who was now holding his datapad with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. "You called us prey because we are soft," Mara said, her voice dropping into a register that made the chamber's floor vibrate. "You were right. Soft things absorb impact. Soft things adapt. But soft things also have a memory." She stepped toward the KE huddle, her shadow stretching long and dark across the floor. They didn't growl. They didn't even flare their bioluminescence. They just waited. Park checked his comms link, his face a mask of iron. "The KE High Command has officially requested a ceasefire," he whispered, loud enough for the board to hear. "They're offering a full restoration of trade routes and triple damages for the colony worlds." The room held its breath, 100 different species waiting for the human response. This was the moment where every other prey species in history had accepted the scrap of mercy and crawled back into their cage. But Mara didn't look at the board. She looked at the Velhari representative, who was watching her with an expression that was no longer just nervousness, but a dawning, terrifying hope. "We aren't interested in a ceasefire, General," Mara said, addressing the empty air where she knew Rethva was listening. "We are interested in a resignation." The translation was stark, brutal, and utterly final. It was the first time in 4 centuries that anyone had demanded the Dominion step down from its seat. The board representative's voice was a frantic staccato. "Ambassador Voss, the Conclave statutes do not permit. The framework is not built for." He stopped. Mara didn't need to finish the sentence for him. The framework was broken. The 16 human ships, the 2 Needles and the 14 Ghosts began to move in unison, a synchronized acceleration that ignored the laws of inertial dampening. They weren't heading for the KE fleet. They were heading for the Conclave's central core. In that moment, the galaxy realized we weren't just here to win a war, we were here to rewrite the physics of power. The synchronized acceleration of the 16 human vessels created a gravimetric wake that rattled the station's structural integrity sensors. They weren't moving to attack, they were moving to occupy. On the tactical display, the ships didn't fan out into a standard firing solution. Instead, they formed a perfect interlocking sphere around the Conclave's central hub, a geometric cage of human engineering that effectively severed the station's high-band communication arrays from the rest of the galaxy. General Isrethva finally appeared on the main screen, her bioluminescence a dead, flickering ash gray. "You are holding the Conclave hostage," she rasped, the translator struggling with the sheer distortion of her voice. Mara didn't look at the screen. She was looking at the board representative whose thin gray fingers were twitching over a blank data slate. "No, General," Mara said, her voice dropping into a lethal, quiet calm. "We are initiating an audit of your entire history, every species that disappeared, every trade route stolen, every volume of your so-called research." Park stepped forward, tapping a command into his handheld terminal. Suddenly, the chamber's walls were flooded with thousands of names, the Velhari, the Moon, the Cherith, and 500 others, scrolling in the white-hot light of human-recovered archives. It was an escalation list of the dead, a ledger of 400 years of Dominion predation, now being broadcasted to every civilian receiver in the sector. The board representative collapsed into his oversized chair, his iridescent robes looking like a funeral shroud. The silence in the chamber was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of an execution. Outside, the KE Warfleet, once 40 strong, now a fragmented 14, simply sat there. They had no doctrine for a war where the enemy had already moved into their house and started reading their mail. "The resignations," Mara said, turning her gaze back to the flickering screen of Esrethva, "will begin with the High Command, then the Trade Board, then you." She paused, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like the gravity of a dying star. "And then we will discuss the reparations." The general's eyes shifted, a desperate predatory animal looking for a gap in the fence that no longer existed. But as the names of the dead continued to scroll, Mara felt a vibration that wasn't from the ships. It was a proximity alert on her personal device. A 17th human signature had just arrived, but it wasn't a ghost ship. It was an old battered civilian freighter with a medical transponder, and it was heading directly for the center of the KE fleet. The freighter was a rusted bucket called the Mercy's Debt, a civilian-class hauler that had no business being within 1,000 kilometers of a KE railgun. On the tactical display, it looked like a grain of sand drifting toward a shark's mouth. The conclave chamber erupted in a frantic, confused clicking as predator species gripped their armrests, waiting for the inevitable bloom of an explosion. General Isrethva's bioluminescence flared a sharp defensive crimson. "Target that vessel!" She roared over to the comms, her voice cracking. "If it breaches the perimeter, we will consider it a kinetic strike." Mara didn't look at the screen. She looked at Park. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was checking a stopwatch. The freighter didn't accelerate. It drifted, its transponder broadcasting a wide-spectrum medical distress code that the KE pathogens resistance systems, the ones built by a woman in Nairobi, automatically recognized as a priority override. The 14 KE warships programmed to protect their crews at all costs stood frozen, their automated firing locks refusing to engage a vessel marked as a critical medical asset. It was a trap of kindness. The freighter came to a halt precisely 300 meters from the KE flagship, its docking bay doors grinding open to reveal not soldiers, but pallets of atmospheric stabilizers and trauma kits. "General," Mara's voice cut through the chaos, steady and cold. "Your third colony world has a failing life support grid. Your second wave wasn't just stopped, It was redirected into your own infrastructure. You have 4 million soldiers currently breathing recycled carbon dioxide because your engineers didn't understand the human-modified cooling loops they've been using for 30 years. The chamber went so quiet the air felt thick. Mara leaned forward, her eyes locked on the flickering image of the general. We didn't send a bomb. We sent the parts you need to keep your people from suffocating. It was the violence then compassion twist that the KE were fundamentally unequipped to process. Their entire cultural architecture was built on the binary of predator and prey. They had no category for an enemy that destroys your fleet in the morning and saves your children by dinner. As Rethva's scales went dark, then silver, then gray, a rapid-fire sequence of a brain trying to find a footing in a reality that no longer made sense. She looked at the freighter, then at the 16 human ghost ships holding the station, and finally at Mara. "Why?" the general whispered. It was a question that 17 volumes of research had never thought to ask. Mara didn't answer immediately. She watched a Velhari representative start to weep, a soft whistling sound that echoed against the scrolling names of the dead. "Because," Mara said finally, "we know what it's like to be the ones waiting for a ship that never comes." But as the first KE transport shuttle detached from the flagship to meet the freighter, Park leaned in, his face tighter than she had ever seen it. "Mara," he whispered, "the KE aren't the ones we need to worry about anymore. Look at the neutral delegations. They aren't relieved. They're terrified." Mara turned her gaze from the flickering screen of a defeated general to the rest of the chamber, and the air in the room suddenly felt like ice. The neutral delegations, the bankers, the architects, the silent observers who had sat in the middle for 4 centuries, were not looking at the relief freighters. They were looking at Mara with the wide-eyed, unblinking stare of a species that had just realized the neighbor they'd ignored for 40 years was actually the one holding the keys to their front door. It wasn't just the KE. Every species in this room realized that if we could save the Dominion's life support with a single civilian freighter, we could just as easily have let it fail. We had demonstrated the ultimate power, the choice to let someone live. Park's terminal chimed again, a sharp, insistent pulse. 3 more signatures, he whispered. "Not human. They're Velrath." The Velrath were the Conclave's de facto police, a predator class that had stayed neutral during the entire conflict, waiting to see which side of the bone was worth biting. They weren't here to help. They were here because they realized the balance of the galaxy had just tilted 45 degrees into a dark, human-shaped void. Mara stepped back to her seat, her feet finally firm on the adjusted floor. The board representative stood up, his voice no longer a whimper but a desperate attempt at authority. "Ambassador Voss," the translator rendered, "the board acknowledges the humanitarian gesture. However, the presence of unauthorized human military assets in a conclave-restricted zone is a violation of Statute 492. He was trying to use the old rules to cage Atemaintiti, fire that had already burned the house down." Mara didn't respond with a speech. She simply looked at the scrolling names of the dead species on the wall, the ledger of 500 worlds, and then back at the representative. "Do you want to discuss statutes?" she asked. "Or do you want to discuss why the Velrath fleet just turned their targeting sensors toward the human colony worlds?" The room went so silent the hum of the life support sounded like a scream. Park's fingers flew over his screen, his face hardening into a mask of pure tactical intent. "They're moving," he said. "They think we're overextended. They think the Mercy's debt was our last card." Mara reached into her pocket and felt the data chip, the pen, and the 3-word message. She looked at the 16 ghost ships on the tactical overlay. They weren't just ships. They were the beginning of an argument that humanity was about to win. "Tell the ghosts to uncloak," she said, her voice dropping into a register that made the board representative flinch. Park hesitated for exactly half a second. All of them? Mara didn't blink. Every single one. On the viewport, the stars didn't change, but the space between them did. Thousands of shimmering distortions began to bleed into the light, revealing a fleet that didn't just outnumber the KE, it dwarfed the entire Conclave's combined military presence. We hadn't sent 16 ships. We had sent the entire species. The board representative collapsed back into his chair, his eyes fixed on the display as the total human count hit 4 figures and kept climbing. Mara looked at the Velroth icons on the screen, which had suddenly, violently come to a dead stop. You were right about one thing in your 17 volumes, she said to the empty air of the chamber. We are emotionally volatile, and we've been very, very patient. The Velroth fleet did not just stop, they drifted, their tactical computers likely crashing as they tried to categorize a threat that had gone from a nuisance to a galaxy-ending event in the span of a heartbeat. Thousands of human ships, industrial haulers, sensor ghosts, and scarred needles filled the viewport until the stars themselves were eclipsed by the dull, matte gray of human hull plating. Mara looked at her notebook and finally drew a single thick line under the words "Call Home." It was finished. The board representative stared at the sensor readout, his thin gray limbs trembling so violently he looked like he might shatter. The human delegation acknowledges the ruling, Mara said, her voice quiet enough to make the entire room lean in. But we are issuing a volume of our own. It's called the New Baseline. The translation rendered the words with a clinical, terrifying precision. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. Park didn't look at the screen anymore. He was watching the Velhari representative, who had stood up and was now walking toward the human delegation, a small, iridescent being finally moving without the hesitation of a species that expected to be eaten. One by one, the other pre-class delegations followed, forming a cluster around Mara and Park that the predator species had no vocabulary for. General Esrethova's bioluminescence remained dark, a silent admission that the apex predator era had ended on a Wednesday. Mara reached into her pocket, pulled out the pen she had retrieved from the ambassador's floor, and set it firmly on the table. "We are not your prey," she said to the silent chamber. "We are the ones who make sure the lights stay on. We are the ones who remember the names you forgot. And from now on, we are the ones who decide who gets to sit at this table." The iconic line hung in the air, a verbal anchor for a new era. Mara walked out of the chamber, her boots clicking in a steady, unhurried rhythm that didn't need to track the exits. She found the observation deck where the Mercy's Det was still docked with the KE flagship, a tiny point of light saving an empire from its own rot. Somewhere on Earth, a researcher was watering her tomatoes, and in Bristol, an engineer was probably sleeping, neither of them knowing that their normal had just inherited the stars. Park handed her a fresh cup of station coffee. It was still mediocre. It was still hot. Mara drank it anyway. The galaxy had spent 200 years asking what we were, she whispered, looking out at the endless fleet. They should have asked what we survived. She didn't look back at the chamber. She didn't need to. The work, as always, was just beginning.